All righty.
Hello, hello.
Hello, everybody. I hope everyone is doing well out there. Where
How
is
you
my...
doing?
So, welcome back. I can't tell you that right now we have about like 900 inches of snow outside.
Do you really?
Yeah, it's incredible. Like actually it snowed like since 5 o'clock p.m. yesterday. And
Ooh,
so we are just buried at home with everybody.
oh man.
Yeah.
Well, it's almost 60 degrees here in New York,
Uh,
so
yeah, it'll be 60 tomorrow, I'm sure. Um,
melt it all away.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, welcome everybody to episode 106 of The Raise. In case this is your first time tuning in, The Raise is a real time sort of interactive series on how to raise money for your startup. And this is not intended to be a workshop or a seminar per se. What it really is a behind the scenes look at the research and the decisions and the actions that I am taking in the process of raising money for my new company, Fanabulous. And in that process, we are going to learn a lot of things. I'm trying to show you what I'm actually going through. And a lot of it is really about showing you what I discard in the process, just as much as like what the final product is. We hope that by letting you see everything I'm going through, you're going to get a process to understand. You're going to get a chance to understand sort of the process, hopefully follow along and emulate or use some of these insights for your own fundraising process as well.
And I'm Pankaj. In this series, I'm going to be mentoring Greg and the Fanabulous team and giving them insight into how angels and VCs think. And I'll ask the same questions that an investor might be asking as Greg goes through his process of trying to raise money for Fanabulous. The only difference is I'll also be sharing some of my insights into the best way to answer some of the questions and also share what an investor might be thinking, but not necessarily saying. More importantly, we want to know your questions and make sure you ask them in the comment section or drop us an email at raise@foundercraft.com or on the website at foundercraft.com. So, Greg, we're on to our third episode diving into the pitch deck. You want to jump right into it?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just set up one little thing. Right, there we go. So this week, we are diving into three very important slides. This has been a great evolution. It's been a helpful process for me as well. So I want to say thanks just to even getting to this part. But today, we are moving on from the product slide to the next three parts of the equation, which would be your traction. I forgot what order they go in. Your revenue and your competition, I think, are the three slides that we're going to cover in this episode. So let's dive right into that.
Yep.
And I'm going to start to explain to you a little bit about the traction slide. And, you know, traction is a challenging thing for a lot of founders, especially early stage companies, because I think we don't often feel like we have enough to hold on to. And fundamentally, from my understanding, and Pankaj, I'd be curious your thoughts. If I were to summarize this problem or what you're trying to accomplish here in this one slide, it's really trying to answer this question of, are you a team that can execute?
Yeah, pretty much, right? Like that's really what folks want to see, and that's what traction tells us, right? Is are you executing? Are you executing well? But it also tells us, have you found something that's working, right? And that's kind of a broad statement to say is something working, but is something working from the marketing and customer acquisition side, and is something working from the product side? Right. So that's really what investors are trying to ascertain when they see a traction slide. Have you figured something out? Are you executing? And if you figured something out, are you doubling down on that? Right. Have you realized that you found something also? Right. Like sometimes founders don't necessarily see the insight because they're so knee deep in the day to day that they don't necessarily see immediately that, oh, we did this and this resulted in something else happening, and ooh, bing, the bells go off. So that's kind of what investors want to see at that point.
Yeah. And one of the challenges I do feel that I know I've suffered with, and I think a lot of founders suffer through, is sort of trying to quantify enough, right? There's a lot of challenges, as a founder going into this process. From our point of view, we feel like we're executing. Now, look, here's the thing. If you know you're not executing, you should not be talking to investors.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
Absolutely.
So if you feel like you're behind the 8 ball, you're not moving the process forward, it's really, there's no point in speaking to an investor. One of the things I remember, Phil Kaplan I ran a pitch clinic once or years ago in SF, and he said the best thing you can do as a startup is not launch, because you're the zenith of your sort of potential before you launch, right? And so every step, one of the challenges I have found, and advice I give founders, is be careful about the steps that you do take, because every decision you make becomes a point to be judged on.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so if you decide
to being judged.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you decide to monetize and then no one buys it, well, guess what? That's not a great signal for you. Right?
Yeah. But at the same time, it shouldn't deter you from running experiments and trying different things.
And I think this is the hard part for founders, is making sure that you tell the right story about how you've done these things, as opposed to saying, well, this was it. We were supposed to make money this way and it didn't work. And so now we're not there. It's all about how you couch some of these problems, I think, ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I've put together a little bit of some thoughts about ways to represent your traction. And for me, traction is action, right? You are moving. Traction means that you are constantly in motion. You are evolving your story as you accomplish more and more, as you learn more and more. And your traction will take many forms over time. It won't be a static or consistent story that you tell. It will change as you gather more data, as you gather more interactions, as you gather more potential revenue. And so I've created what I call the traction timeline, which I think is something that every founder should be able to leverage as they move forward. And again, this is likely how you will update this slide over time. You'll start at a high level, sort of conceptual level, right? And then end with more of like a revenue oriented sort of level. Now, this is not to say that this is the revenue slide per se, right? That's a different slide, has a different purpose. But I think the height of sort of traction is that you are achieving revenue. And so I'm going to go through each of these steps. Pankaj, I'll give you a chance to give feedback on each one, though, I think.
Yeah, sure.
So at the earliest part of your life, you're just getting started. You have just an idea, maybe, right? You're maybe talking maybe some friends and family. You haven't really figured out. You know that you have an itch or a sense that there's something going on over there, but you don't know for sure, right? The minimum you can do at that conceptual phase is really to verify that your core business concept is viable, right? And the way to do that verification, I think, is through a combination of qualitative and quantitative forces, right? So as you know, the traditional sort of lean startup, get out of the building, go talk to people, right? I think that's an effective tool. Going and having conversations with people that you think may be in the wheelhouse starts to give you access to actual stories from real individuals that maybe can verify whether or not your nose is actually in the right direction, right? Because I do believe where most of us start is we have like some sense of a problem, and at least this has been my process. I try to then quantify that problem from an industry point of view. So I try to say, like, have I met enough people? Do I know enough people who are experiencing this problem? Is the industry that I think I'm moving into, I want to understand the dimensions of it. It doesn't mean that it has to be a huge industry, by the way. It just means that I understand it. Is there enough meat on the bones there to even go after it? Because like some industries which are much smaller but have higher value, you're never going to get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of potential customers. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you can't build a great business in there. But you need to understand sort of what you're getting into, who is sort of the edge cases, the players inside of it. And then I think trying to find ways to talk to people that have this problem. Now, again, as an investor, Pankaj, when you're seeing this, people haven't talked to anybody who even has the problem. What do you think?
Yeah. Did you just dream this up? Right. Like, I mean, you want to see somebody that has said, yeah, I have this problem also, right? And the best problems is whoever you talk to, especially the investor, they'll raise their hand and say, yeah, I've seen this before, or I've faced this problem before, and I haven't been able to find a solution. So, if you haven't talked to other folks that have this same problem that you do, you haven't done your homework, right?
Yep.
Or you're just too early in the process, one or the other.
Yeah. And I also think, by the way, one of the important parts of gathering this data early on, or some of this, like I said, this is largely potentially like conversations you've had. Maybe it's a great quote from someone now that you've talked to that really like resonated with why you're on the mission you're on. It could be some simple surveys that you do on your own where you're trying to get some qualitative data from maybe your network that tries to give you a sense of what's happened. And of course, maybe there are surveys out there already where people have asked this exact question and you can sort of point to that. But one of the reasons I think this is important is that investors don't know everything about every space either. And
really,
they may tell you they do, right?
Yeah.
And I think what they're good at is the pattern recognition of sort of how problems are repeating inside of a space and how the sort of the mechanics of how to grow into a space, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes they need a little bit of that inertia, that kick to sort of say like, I never really thought about that. It's interesting that to even hear this is true. And so what you want to create minimally at this point, I believe, is a splinter in someone's mind. You want them to kind of constantly be going back to it, or as they're out there talking to more companies, more businesses, more enterprises, that maybe these ideas or themes start to show up a little bit more for them. And eventually they're going to come back and be like, you know what? I never thought about this before. And suddenly I've seen it now like 5 times come up in one way or another.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when you buy a car and then after you go outside on the road, you're like, everyone's got my car.
Yeah.
You kind of want that. Or like when you have a breakup and like every song is a sad song, right? Like you're trying ultimately to inspire or show them, shine a light on potentially something that they maybe haven't considered.
Yeah.
Right. At that conceptual phase. Now you will find some people ideally that like totally get your space, totally have the problem and they understand it for, up close, but sometimes they don't. And that's okay.
Yeah.
But there's always a little bit more education involved then, right? In sort of like getting them to a common ground with you.
Especially when you're going into something that's a industry that's relatively new, hasn't necessarily seen solutions before, right? So that's more prevalent in those types of situations.
Or the blue or the ocean, right? Like, in some ways. Another space, I was just reading this great article. I'm going to see if we can get the author to come on and chat with us, actually. But he talked about another market, which was sort of the problems that we didn't know we had, or the problems that are not that frustrating, but they're persistent. And so sometimes it's about shining a light or creating visibility around those things as well.
Yeah.
That can actually be very useful to you. So once again, I do think thinking about that conceptual level of problem, you may be at that stage. Don't be ashamed of that, but do your work to make sure that that concept seems like an iceberg. Like there's a small piece that maybe you can see now, and there's a larger piece that at work underneath it. Now, after you've gotten to this phase, most, I think, technical founders likely start almost at step 2 by default, which is they start building crap, right? And so that product, the second step in the timeline for me is the product part, where you actually are going on and verifying or creating your some workable prototype or something like that. Now, I believe then this gives you the opportunity to start to track the status and the learnings across your design and development process. So this could be everything from mock-ups to interactive prototypes to working prototypes that I think are all potentially helpful in showing, again, are we a team that can execute? Are we a team that can listen to people? Are we a team that can turn feedback into something meaningful? So what do you think on that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to that is how fast you're iterating on the feedback you're getting, right? As part of the product, because that's a component of traction as well. right? If you are iterating quickly on the feedback that you're getting, especially from your actual product users, you should be moving closer to the fit stage if you're successful in executing on that.
Yes. I have a question for you, and this really relates to, I think, very much to us, but I guess, many founders find themselves in this situation.
Yeah.
When you are part-time on a project, or it's a side project, or it's a, nights and weekends sort of thing, your timelines just don't look, I think, as the same. And I, for example, I feel a fear, for example, applying to YC, they ask it who's full-time.
Yep.
How strong is that signal about full-time versus not, are there any good ways or ways to leverage or talk about this problem sort of up close, or sort of give you a little bit of breathing room?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? Because I mean, I've been there. I've had my moonlighting startup back in 2004, 2005. I quit my job. My co-founder didn't. And eventually we never even launched the product publicly, and we just shut it down and went our separate ways. But when it comes to fundraising, it's a lot of it depends on what stage you're at and who you're talking to. If you are talking to institutional investors like a YC, or even other accelerator programs, they really do want to see all the founders full-time, or at least the majority of the founders full-time. Depending on which institutional investor or accelerator program you go to, some of them want to see the product people full-time, some of them want to see the business people full-time. I think a lot of them lean towards product first, because unless you can build a product and get it out the door fast enough, having the marketing or BD folks going out and trying to sell isn't really going to be that important, right? So when it comes to angel investors, they could be a little bit more forgiving, especially if they know you, right?
Yeah.
If they know you, I think it's a slightly different question. Or the answer is a little bit different. If they don't know you and they were referred to you by somebody that they trust, who also trusts you, again, I think the way you answer that question is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
But it is important to see that, there is a majority of the team full-time. There is the CEO, whoever that is. A lot is going to rest on their shoulders. The CEO should be full-time. Ideally, you want to see whoever's on the product side also full-time. But, in some cases, you kind of say, all right, look, I get it. You have a personal situation. You have, a new baby. You have a new house. You got to pay a mortgage. And you need to have a little bit of money before you can jump ship and come on full-time. And, joining this accelerator program or raising this round is going to facilitate that. Okay, right? Some investors can be reasonable and say, you know what, it's not a hard no because you're not all full-time. Let me understand why you're not all full-time. And if I can help solve the problem, great. And I might be more willing to help solve the problem if I really like what I see so far.
Yeah. And at least I would say, like, probably in our defense, like, we're planning to use the money to be full-time. Well, actually, two of us are full-time, so I guess that.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, that in a lot of cases, that is a red flag for a lot of folks. It's like, well, so wait, you're not going in head first. You're waiting for me to stick my neck out before you jump in? No, not really. Right. That's not going to happen. And you could understand from an investor's perspective who doesn't necessarily know the team, doesn't know the founders, saying, well, why am I going to put my money at risk if you guys aren't putting yourselves at risk, right? So there is that to take into account as well, right? But if it's like, hey, two of us are full-time and we're pushing ahead, but, one or two of our founders, they need a paycheck and we can't give them a paycheck yet. So can you work with us? All right. Yeah. Some investors will say, fine, we get it. We've been there. And, if we can help solve that problem and get you guys moving faster, we will. Other investors might say, no, either you guys are all full time, or I'm not risking my capital on something that you guys aren't willing to risk your lives on.
Right. Yeah. Well, I guess becomes part of that distinction of what's it really mean to be founder friendly versus sort of not, right?
Yeah.
And obviously your relationships help, and I think we're probably covered because two of us are full time, and I will be the CEO and I run product, and the other guy is technical, building it. So
I think in your case it should be okay, right? And there's also pedigree, right? You have done startups in the past. You've had successful exit. You've been a part of YC. So all of those things again will come and help you, even though two of your co-founders may not be full time today.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So, but in general, for first time founders, it's a little bit harder.
Yeah. Well, I guess the proof is in the pudding as well, it seems, though, right? So if you have something that like is actually working and ready, and you did it all on the side, it's hard to argue with the results.
Absolutely.
So that doesn't mean you have to be full time, guys. I guess, but if you're not full time and not delivering and not shipping,
then don't bother.
That's the worst case scenario, right?
Yeah.
Like for fundraising, absolutely. Good point, though. Fair enough, I think. All right. So now we go to the third step, I think, which is sort of in the evolution of traction. And in my mind, it's when you've gotten to fit, right? So you've established not only like some kind of like development process, product process, feedback process loop, right? But you are also developing now relationships with potential customers, beta users, et cetera, and increasing the volume of feedback and increasing the volume of usage. And ultimately, I believe that, businesses that do succeed create a deep connection with their customers. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's a frequent one, AKA they use you every day, but the relationship is strong and meaningful. And so the opportunity to then express fit becomes another avenue of demonstrating the traction you've achieved. And so in my mind, the kinds of metrics I look at here is sort of the instrumentation that you might put into your own application. So when you start to be able to report on your KPIs for performance, for usage, for addiction, for NPS, et cetera, like these numbers start to become more visible. What I believe they do is they show you or start to tell a story about the fit that you do have in the market with your potential customers. It does. Now, this is, again, before revenue. Most of us go through a period of like alpha or beta where we are giving our product away to customers in exchange for this feedback. So what do you think? What are your thoughts there?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think most early stage startups spend the most amount of time in this fit stage, or at least trying to figure out whether they found fit. You bring up an interesting point about KPIs and metrics. I think a lot of founders don't really spend a lot of time up front thinking about what their KPIs are. And because they haven't spent that much time, they wind up spending a lot of time and wasting resources while they're in this fit stage, right? They're kind of like bouncing back and forth between product and fit because they haven't really defined their KPIs and they're not measuring them clearly. So I think those founders that do measure their KPIs effectively probably are able to move from fit to revenue a little bit more quickly. So, I think that's a really important piece, is like really defining your KPIs up front, measuring them, reevaluating them, and kind of seeing what needs to happen with the product so that you can see that you are approaching real product market fit, and now you can move towards revenue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the last part you mentioned there is actually really important, because the KPIs we start out with are almost always wrong.
Yeah,
right.
But you have to have something to start with.
We always think like, oh, of course everyone's going to care about this, and rarely have I found that you're right in that assessment. And even if you are, it's okay. There may be other things that are there. Now, I'll make a point here about KPIs, which is that you may have a primary KPI, but it's also important to consider the supporting ones. So, for example, if you look at the number, let's say our KPI is like the number of surveys done or put into the world. There's sort of like, there's two things to consider there. There's like a rate limit on how many people may do, right? So like you have to set like sort of a ceiling, right, on what that looks like. Someone's not going to do one of these every day, for example, right? And if anyone does, that's kind of an outlier. Maybe you want to understand what they're doing. But at the same time, there may be other supporting metrics that point to that increase in the attention or usage that are like a pyramid. And so you may not be able to see this top level number move as fast as you'd hope, but it doesn't mean that the underneath the supporting ones aren't moving. So I think over time, we don't know what those supporting numbers are early on, and it takes us a bit of time to understand, well, this is a proxy for that behavior increasing. And so when we see this number start to go up, it may not be the number you want to report, for example, because like nobody gives a crap like how many times they sign in, right? You know, like, but you need to start to look at that, right? Like, so if people aren't signing in, you know that they're actually not getting closer to completing the actual KPI.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let's get to our last one in our sort of traction timeline, and that is revenue. And I don't, in my notion of putting this here, I think it's about accounting for your growth, the deals, or key revenue milestones per se, as opposed to say charting out the entirety of your revenue here. The revenue slide has a different purpose, and you're going to cover that next. But I do believe that the ultimate expression of traction is revenue. And the more that you can point to the idea that you are generating revenue, you've got LOIs, you've got commitments, you close a deal, you have pipeline, whatever those things are, those are all great things. And you can allude to those as part of this process of trying to explain the traction that you're acquiring.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's a good place to start the revenue section of this.
Yep.
Revenue or business model, I think is incredibly important. But like you said, it's not something that you can really focus on until you have found some sort of product market fit. The real thing is, how will you make money and how much of it will you make? Even for B2C companies, it's important to start thinking about this. You want to really, depending on who your investors are, right? There are plenty of companies that can delay revenue for a long time because their investors have seen some sort of product market fit. You could be a Snapchat with like, intense amount of time being spent in app, and you could be a little bit generous in giving out the money that the company needs until a much later stage. But as a company, you need to still keep thinking about, where are you going to generate your revenue and how much of it do you think you can generate? So let's move on to the next slide after that, which is 4 things about revenue. So revenue model, right? That's the first thing. What is your fundamental revenue model? Are you based on transactions like an e-commerce site? Are you a subscription business? Are there something
Or hybrid?
Or yes,
or services? Yeah.
Yeah. There are lots of different revenue models. You could come up with a new revenue model. I think investors like to see revenue models that have been tried and true. Mm-hmm. So if you are transaction based, you are subscription based, you're something in the middle, you are a pure enterprise sales process. Those are things that people know and understand and are comfortable with. But that doesn't mean that a new revenue model won't necessarily work. It's just you may have to delay that, until you have real solid fit, right? And real great traction and usage before somebody's willing to experiment and give you the leeway to experiment with that new revenue model. So traditional business models, revenue models around transactions and subscriptions work really well. Investors like funding those because they understand them, and you can always find people that understand those business models to help you increase your revenue, right? So I think that's a really important.
Right. There are investors who prefer certain or have
Yes.
developed expertise.
Absolutely, absolutely. Some investors, may have come from a particular background where, if you came from the telecom business, you're a subscription business, right? And you might prefer those models. The thing with subscription businesses is also your revenue smooths out over time, right? It's less erratic. So people like subscription revenues. Transactions could be very erratic, especially in the beginning, a lot of peaks and valleys until you grow to a certain size. Then you might be able to see smoother revenue from transactions. But it takes time, right? Like even Stripe has taken many years to get to the point where they're at today. So there are investors who prefer certain types of business models. And if you are going to pitch a certain investor, you should do your research to see what kind of business models have they funded in the past, and how have they been able to help those business models, right, and generating revenue.
And we did talk about this episode 3. So
what's that?
We talked about this in episode 3.
Yeah,
so
exactly. So revenue boosters, which is the next one. This is something that probably comes into play a little bit later on. So once you have product market fit, you're trying out your different business models. Once you have a business model that you've tested out that seems to be working, now you want to start thinking about, well, okay, how can I generate more revenue from an existing customer, for example? That's an accelerant, right? You're not going. It's cheaper to upsell an existing customer than it is to go out and acquire a new customer. So can you give them some freebies? Can you add new features that they're willing to pay for? Can you upsell them a new product that you might have released, right? That may be complementary to your primary product, right? Can you go from transactions to subscriptions and give them some sort of discount on the subscription, but they can do more, and overall they're going to be paying a little bit more, right? So these are types of things that you want to start thinking about and start putting into place as your revenue model has stabilized. Right?
Something I do think about here as well, like especially with our business, is if you are working on potentially like BD deals or partnerships that maybe have a potential to onboard lots of customers in one shot, or give you access to pools of customers that is somewhat like go to market. I do think like that you may want to figure out if it's worth mentioning, if there's a high degree of certainty, or you feel like you've tested that relationship already and understand that it will perform. I think the worst case you could make is like all these partnerships are going to lead to all this stuff, and then they don't lead to anything, because by the way, most partnerships don't lead to anything. So I do think like it is worth thinking about if any potential plans you have that maybe give you an unfair advantage in starting with more customers than everybody else.
A good point. That's a good point. Okay. How are we on time? All right. I think we're pretty good on time. Actually, no, we're probably not, because we still have to go through competition, and then we have to jump back into
the slides.
All right.
We'll be good.
Go through this. Revenue sustainability. This is really important, right? Like, how sticky is your revenue? Just the other day, I was having a chat with an old friend of mine, and he is in the process of launching another business sometime, let's say mid next year, which, once it's going to be really hard to get customers onto the platform. But once he does, these guys are going nowhere. They will be there for the life of their business, right? As long as their business survives, they will be there. And, that is incredibly sticky revenue, right? And finding stuff like that is not easy. Back in 2004-ish, that whole span, we had a middle back office business for hedge funds. This is what hedge funds do. They kind of just say, all right, how do we outsource the operations and technology, let somebody else handle all that while they focus on research and trading. So, essentially we became the books and records for all of these hedge funds. And it was really, really hard and painful for any of those funds to get up and move and go somewhere else, because they had to then take everything that we had, they had to duplicate that somewhere else. They had to move all of the records to another platform because they were all digital records. So our churn was really low and our lifetime value was huge, right? Like, yes, our customer acquisition costs were pretty high also, but our lifetime value was insane, because those customers, as long as they were in business, they didn't go anywhere. They stayed, or unless we screwed up royally, then they would get up and leave. But it was still expensive for them to get up and leave. So this sustainability of revenue is incredibly important. But not all businesses have very sticky revenue. If you're in a B2C space like social media, for example, it's not really sticky revenue. That revenue will move around based on the platform and what kind of usage they have on that platform. Like, people have been poo-pooing Facebook for years. Oh, Facebook's grown too big. It's gonna, that's it. There's, the ads aren't working as well. Every quarter, it's like, whoa, the revenue just keeps growing. So, I think that's something for us to keep in mind when you're building out your revenue model, is how sustainable is your revenue going to be based on what your business is.
I will say the one thing I'll just note there is sometimes you may not have customers that live a long time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not necessarily churn. It's just that the window of viability with them, like say for new parents, if you deal with breastfeeding moms, right? That does, it is a perennial audience, but it also, the individual customer does not last forever.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
so that's okay, but it's important to acknowledge it and sort of be clear about that.
Yeah, exactly. And to know that, right? Because then you can build certain things into the product, like the upsells, right? The revenue accelerants. You can build those into your model and say, okay, well, we know that you're eventually going to stop feeding and nursing, but what are you going to need in order to, wean the baby off, and what's the next step, right? So, those are things that you can build in also. Revenue growth. This is an interesting one. This kind of, goes back to traditional sales in a lot of way. And, building out your pipeline. Are you hitting your targets? What are the things that you're doing to hit those targets? Do you have to keep expanding your sales team or your BD team to keep revenue growing? Are you hiring folks that are really spending a lot more on digital marketing than they were before? So the cost of acquiring revenue and the cost of keeping revenue growing, is that growing also, right? That's something to keep in mind and think about as your revenue is growing, right? Because that's going to compress your margins over time if you're spending more to acquire or retain existing revenue.
And I would say also, I would think about if the market is growing, right?
Sure.
So a lot of time, if you're selling into a new market or terraforming a new market,
yeah,
at what rate can you anticipate? This is how we eventually you try to get to making predictions about sales. And so you do want to, you should try to account for those changes as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think those are all great points. And if a market's slowing, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's another thing, right? If you're in the petroleum business,
right. Actually, yeah, the opposite is also true.
Exactly. Right. You got to be thinking about that also, right? So yeah, absolutely. All right. So I think
we've got about 20 minutes left. I unfortunately have a hard stop, so I will go fast through this part on competition.
Yep.
And then we will get into the deck itself. Oh, wrong window. So in the competition part, I think it's important to really address the question of what do you know that no one else knows? And it may not be that you know something different. It may also be that you're willing to act on something differently as compared to how everyone else acts. And so I think that that's an important opportunity for you to consider or pursue. If there is no market, there is no business. So sometimes being the only one doing something is not a good thing. They often say, well, either it's too hard to do or everyone's failed trying to do it in the past. And that's why that market doesn't exist. It's a common feedback I've heard from folks. And so I do think that you really probably do have some competitors. If there's no way you don't have competition. So you just need to figure out where they are, what they kind of look like, or who they are, as opposed to presuming there are none. Now, the reality is that there may be analogs, there may be adjacent, they may be people who could move into your space. So you need to think about those things when you're acknowledging your competition. But saying that you have none makes you look kind of foolish, right? Like there's all, as they say, if you are thinking about an idea, there's 10 other entrepreneurs working on that idea right now also.
But founders say that all the time.
And I remind him about the other 10 every time also. So absolutely, it's good that there's competition in my book. Not necessarily that it's overloaded or there's an overwhelming number of people, and not that there's like everyone just waiting to get into what you're about, what you are currently doing or planning to do. Because the reality is, you know, I've met founders who are like, well, we're the only ones who can do this now. And I'm like, well, what about the big guys? And they're like, well, they wouldn't do it. I'm like, wait, we don't really know what their roadmaps look like. We don't know what they're already currently developing that they haven't announced yet. So just don't have too much hubris about the uniqueness of what you are actually creating. So I think there are 3 good ways to talk about competition, and I will show you each of them. And I've mocked up sort of an example of doing it for Fanabulous. So do you have an idea to understand it? Method number 1, I would say, is to group companies by function. So if you're building, like we are, say, a CRM and marketing automation platform, well, guess what? That means that CRM companies and marketing automation companies are potentially types of competitors. And so a lot of the startups that we will see today, they're blending together common functions and combining them in new and interesting ways, which means that the constituent things that you're combining all present potential opportunities for competition. So just to show you as an example, here's if I were to try and present our competitors more by function. So you can see there's like audience tools, you know, sort of tools like, you know, the panel-based things like Nielsen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's like the survey-based tools, you know, so Survey Monkeys and the Typeforms, et cetera, and even some of the social-specific companies like Gleam and Rafflecopter. Then, of course, there's the big enterprise side, the platform side, which would be like CRM systems, you know, so Salesforce and HubSpot naturally, and then even marketing automation platforms, Pardot and Marketo. Now, one thing you'll note down here, which you can't see because I just hovered, I did indicate potential acquirers, and this is just feedback, and I'm curious what you think about this, Pankaj, but I've heard that there's an interest in understanding who could potentially acquire you. So how well stated should that be, I guess, is the question.
Well, you know, I think a lot of that depends on stage also.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, if you're a super early stage company, I don't think most investors are thinking about acquisitions at this stage, right?
Okay.
Because they want to see really, can you figure out the market? Can you figure out the product? Can you grow the business and potentially grow the market also? Could you be the leading player that might acquire some other companies? So, you know, I don't think it's as important for a really early stage company.
Okay.
If you are a Series A, Series B company, I think it becomes a little bit more important to start thinking about some of these things.
Got you. Okay, good.
Acquirers could also be competitors.
Yes, absolutely. So as you can see, I've indicated a lot of people who I think are competitors potentially as acquirers, but for our deck, I will actually remove it when we get to the final version.
Yeah.
Because I agree. I'd rather not be talking about it now either.
Yeah.
Now, second method is what I would call by capability. So if you're in a highly verticalized space where you're literally taking on like you're a new entrant into a well-established sort of set of competitors, or potentially as a drill down on each of these functional categories, you may look at sort of comparing your capabilities to theirs. So I've put together sort of like a totally sort of meaningless grid here, but I think you get the idea. This is like might be something that's on your website. You know, I increasingly see this now actually as a way of getting SEO and getting marketing, where companies are actually having comparisons of them to other platforms that people may be considering built into their websites. Yeah. So that if you're searching for MailChimp, I want you to find me. So I say us versus MailChimp so that people actually will end up on your page as well and be able to find you.
Yeah. So really quickly, I think this is a great slide to have in the deck. Most decks that I see don't have it broken out like this. they'll just list the competition, like here are these companies, so like you had on the previous slide.
Yeah.
They won't necessarily talk about why your product is better than the potential competitors that are out there. And comes back to, I forget which slide it was. I think it was the solution slide in your deck where it talks about, real value that's being created, right?
Yeah.
So I think like tying these pieces together and showing like how it's not features, right? But it's really what are the things that are creating value for your customer, and showing how some of the competitors, how you stack up against the competitors in that space. I think that's a great slide to have, because immediately you can see like, okay, well, the competitors, there are these competitors, so it's not, something that no one's ever done before.
Yeah.
But they're also behind on a lot of these things where you guys are thinking much further along about these things and potentially building those things out, or have those things built out already. So
yeah,
I think this is a great slide to have.
Great. Okay, that's good to know, actually, because the next one I have is not my favorite. So I kind of like this one. Now the tweak I'd ask you about here is, in our case, since we compete against a couple of industries, would you think it's okay if I maybe put the different kinds of so from that previous slide, put those categories across and then compare to them generically, as opposed to like a product? Like, so if I say CRM platforms, then I could sort of talk about, like how a CRM compares to Fabulous versus how a marketing automation compares to Fabulous. Or do you think it's better to have like a specific company, like here's how Salesforce compares to us or something?
I think having a specific company will resonate better with folks.
Okay.
Because when you say CRM, now I'm going to stop and I'm going to say, well, okay, well, are we talking about Salesforce, which is like this big enterprise CRM, or are we talking about like, Sugar CRM, which is, open source and people are using it as a personal CRM? I have to start thinking now.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily want me to start thinking.
Right. And I guess that the hard part, which I haven't figured out how to answer yet, then would be, that means you need to have like a fairly direct analog to.
Well, I think you could, yes and no. I think you can kind of stretch that a little if you need to, right? Like you could technically throw, Salesforce on this slide, and you could say, well, Salesforce doesn't do any of these things.
Okay, got you.
Right. But they compete with us in the CRM. And
so pick a company from each category, maybe, and
potentially a company from each category.
Yeah.
But also I think it depends on which deck you're putting the slide into.
Right.
The deck that you're presenting to somebody, this is a good slide to have in.
Right.
Okay. Because you're providing the context around it. The
Yeah.
deck that you're emailing out to somebody, probably not, because a lot of context could get lost.
Right.
But this particular slide is pretty simple and straightforward. It's like, okay, here are potential competitors, and here's how you stack up against them. Okay. Right. But if you start throwing in, Salesforce and other companies, then it's like, well, I'm losing the context now. So leave that for the slide that you're presenting.
Okay. And then I also think maybe potentially, as we said, as you adjust this for different investors, they may have familiarity with other players in this space. And so it may be useful to point out how you're different from things they may know in particular.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Good to know. I will work on adjusting some of this. Now, my last thing was sort of like more of that Gartner sort of industry look, which is like, what is our unique selling sort of proposition? And so how do we stand apart, or when do we clearly stand apart? And so I think the important thing about using this format is don't do it if you don't stand out. So if you're going to end up surrounded and swarmed by a bunch of other people, this slide or format doesn't work for you. So just to show you as an example, this would be sort of trying to imagine that, the classic 2x2 grid. It is a challenging process because you do need to figure out what the vectors are. And so in this case, for us, for example, I've looked at sort of how we capture data and then how we work with audience is sort of the two primary vectors that I think are most critical to us. And so, there's an evolution. There's companies who just do data capture. There's people who do data management. And then there's people who do conversion focused activity with data. And then, of course, there are people who are like, well, you have to have your own audience. And then there's people who are like pure social, where you have to bring your own audience. And again, this was not something, I think this is harder to leave without explaining or providing context. So this is a challenging slide in some ways, but at the same time, if you are able to find like some permutation of vectors where you could tell have a good story and a narrative around it, it can be effective. And so you can see, like, again, like I was saying, if you're not going to be in the top right of your system, this is not the place for you to be.
But this is the cynic in me speaking. Yeah. Every startup I see has one of these slides, and they're always up and to the right.
I agree.
Like the traction slide, always up and to the right.
Absolutely. My point, though, is that if you're not really, like, be honest with yourself, if you really don't stand apart, I think this is a bad idea, right? This slide.
I don't disagree.
Right.
I don't disagree.
And I would say for me, I actually functionally do really believe this is true, because the traditional tools are not in the social wheelhouse. And we are the closest competitor I would say we do have is someone like Sprinkler, who is providing a real experience around this, does have the onboarding. They have the closest toolkit to what we're imagining, I think. And there are other players. This is not my favorite either, by the way, but.
Well, if you don't love the slide, don't put it in.
So here's the thing. I like this slide. I love the grid better. I just have more things to reconcile in my brain about how to present that grid.
So leave it out until you've reconciled that.
Yes, I'm working. So that's, your feedback's been really good, and that's where I am now on it. So so that's where we got to. And so why don't we go into the deck now, just to provide everyone the update as well. So here we are, title slide, same as before. I have made some adjustments, a number of adjustments now for based on what we talked about last time, which was really about, we were saying sort of the CRM and marketing automation numbers were sort of getting in the way potentially. So what I tried to do, let me see if does this get bigger if I make this bigger? What I tried to do was to now show that the lack of these tools is preventing ROI and revenue from being created. And what I pointed out at the bottom was really just the percentage of people that don't know the answer at the bottom. I converted up here to now a percentage as well.
Yep.
I put an estimate in underneath.
Yep.
Just of a number, so at least you sort of have a hint of the scale of it. But I'm relying more on the broader statistic as opposed to the individual numbers. So I think it makes it less mentally challenging. Like, what are you saying? Like, no way, it's not $200 billion business.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I think it looks better. The only thing that is now annoying me is that social ads are $120 billion, but from a funnel perspective, it's smaller than influencer marketing visually.
Yes.
Right.
So you're right. Actually, I can change the order of those because I think that's fine. I think actually influencer marketing. So what would you recommend? Putting influencer marketing at the top?
Well, our social ads are kind of a subset of influencer marketing, right?
So interestingly enough, yes, and this is definitely interpretive. I believe that most people target. Well, there's two ways that social ads are being used. They're used to target people who actually see your content or engage with it.
Yep.
And then they're also used just to broadly recruit people. So I think they could go at the top of the stack. Maybe what I'll do is I'll put the 13.8% across the top, and then I'll rearrange those in order.
Yeah.
Right. So that the numbers line up better. Okay, great. I can make that change. No problem.
Yeah. Because just visually, it's like, wait.
I absolutely agree. In my head, I know the ads are often used as a way to drive conversion because they can sort of have the links and the sellable stuff. But yes, I'll rearrange.
Or what if you just take out social ads and just call it social marketing?
Social marketing.
So it's just broad, right? Yeah. Now you can just move that.
You just have two.
Well, you can have just, instead of social content, just content.
Right.
Right. And then social, and then influencer marketing.
Okay.
Right. Because now if you're talking about content-based marketing, that's 178 billion. Social is 120 billion. Influencer marketing, which is a subset, is 15 billion. Right.
Okay.
So kind of.
All right. So I'll swap social ads for social marketing, put it first, and then influencer marketing right below.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's cool. I could do that. Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
So market, I didn't have that much time to spend too much on it, but I did make some changes based on what we were talking about. I tried to indicate where we are today a little more clearly at the top as opposed to at the bottom. I showed where we're going to over time. I added some directional arrows to sort of give a sense of movement that is where we're going. And then I readjusted those numbers at the bottom to sort of highlight that, 8 billion is where we are today. We're going to 15 billion.
Yep. That looks good.
And we had with our estimate of sort of the rate of increase as well.
Yeah. So that part looks good. Again, I'm just going to nitpick on the visual.
Yeah, sure.
You're telling me you're targeting 95 million plus social businesses and influencers.
Yeah.
But the way the visual shows me is like you're targeting this, the intersection of the two. Right.
So I guess I'm not necessarily saying I'm targeting the intersection of the two. I'm simply, actually, probably the better way to put it, I should put those 25 million inside the 70 million.
Right. Like it should be a
fully inside.
Like 70 outside, 25 next to it. So overall, it's 95 million. Because the way visually right now, what it's showing, especially with the arrow going through that intersection, it's implying like, oh, that's 95 million. But wait, how does that visually work? Because that's 70 and that's 25.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, and I've thought about that in the past actually, because I do agree that it really is the 25 million is inclusive likely of the 70 million.
Yeah. No, the 25 is inclusive of the 95. So it's 70 plus 25.
Yes.
Right. So this is showing me something completely different visually.
That's right, because the overlap is the part you pay attention to.
That's right.
All right, I'll fix that. All right, good. So I did adjust the solution slide as well, and I gotta run in 2 minutes, so I'm just gonna go fast. But I was thinking more about this, and we can cover it more in the next episode. But I did go through and try to put together a better explanation of what we were filling, how we were filling the gap. So this is really designed now to show the products, the suite of that we're creating, as well as like the analog or what it replaces in the traditional world.
Gotcha.
And we can do feedback on it later. Product slides are the same. And then the traction slide, I got down to here's our MVP. I tried to use sort of a system of like batteries to show like what we've actually made so far, where we are in development, and when we're going to be getting to launch. I haven't put dates on this, so I think I may put like some dates in potentially for when we anticipate these being. And then down below, though, which is to me the more important part, I really tried to show that there was fit. That people were using like how the usage of our product was driving outsized engagement and outsized benefit for our customer compared to the things that could be done. It's a little wordy, so I'm not like completely in love with the way it is at the bottom part yet, but I may eliminate some of these things and just put some of the industry metrics instead. But I was trying to show that, like, for example, we're getting a 5.2% average click-through rate compared to like 1.6 on a Facebook ad or 1.9 on search ads, which I think is really compelling.
Yeah.
Same thing on our completion rates. We're getting a 48.2% completion rate, and that's what people watching to like 2 minutes of video, which compares to 10 to 15% and industry standard for completion rates on surveys. And then, of course, the number of fans that we're actually capturing, I think, is also pretty impressive, considering our brands are spending not that much money to actually generate this. Yeah. And we can chat about this after. I know I do have to run, but here's my revenue slide. So I took our product line, expanded it. I tried to indicate what I believe our pricing is going to sort of look like. Of course, this is all a work in progress. And I tried, for example, on the asks, which is the first product we're launching, I indicated where I believe there are add-ons or accelerators. Again, same thing. There are some add-ons potential in the other two products as well. This is a start. It's really showing how we plan to make money, not necessarily fully representing all of it just yet. And then I'll get the competition slide. This is what I used because it was one I made first, but I think I'll go to that table as well in the process. So I do have to run, unfortunately, but we will go over these in the next episode. I promise. And happy Thanksgiving if you are out there and it is something that you will be enjoying with your family and friends, or if not, well, happy Thursday. Happy Thanksgiving or happy holiday or day off and day off, ideally. And we will be seeing you next Friday at 10 a.m., same time as this episode. We really appreciate your time. This has been episode 106 of The Raise. We're deep dive into the pitch deck. We will complete our look at the pitch deck in the next episode. So we look forward to seeing you there. And thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Take care, Greg. All right. Take care, Pankaj. Bye. All right. Take care. Bye.